When the lion falls, does the savannah truly breathe easier? For more than a decade, one name echoed across the Lake Chad Basin like a myth whispered in smoke: Bakoura. Mothers dared not say it aloud. Soldiers spatted with rage. Villagers in Difa, Baga, and Maiduguri would glance at the horizon and wonder, is he watching? Is he near? Born Ibrahim Amda, but feared as Bakoura. He wasn't just another warlord. He was the phantom of the marshes, the heir to Abu Bakr Shekau's brutality, the shadow that danced after villages burned and classrooms turned into graves. For years, he was a ghost that refused to die. But on the morning of August 15th, 2025, that ghost met fire in the reeds of Chilawa, where the marshes murmur secrets and the desert blinks in silence. Niger's armed forces unleashed a strike so precise, so sudden, that even the sky seemed to gasp. 3 bombs fell, clean, sharp, merciless, and when the dust cleared, Bakoura was gone. This wasn't just a military operation, it was a rupture in history, because for years, the story of this region had been told with blood and despair. It was a story where the villain always returned, where the state always arrived too late, where terror seemed carved into the land. But now, the script changed. Niger, a country too often dismissed as poor, overstretched, invisible, had struck first, not with foreign help, not as a junior partner in someone else's war, but alone, decisively, with sovereignty roaring like thunder over the marsh. And so, the question echoes still. When a lion falls, does the savannah truly breathe easier, or has the storm only begun? Because in the Sahel, the fall of one tyrant is rarely the end. It's the pause before the next name rises. Stay with us. Because what happened on August 15th wasn't just the death of a man, it was the beginning of a reckoning. And if you believe that Africa's silent battles deserve a voice, yours, then let this be the moment you speak. Like, comment, and subscribe. Because history isn't made by watching, it's made by remembering. Before the fire came, there was silence. And before Bakoura became a ghost, he was a boy, barefoot, nameless, unseen, born in the dust of northern Nigeria. Ibrahim Amda did not enter the world with blood on his hands, but the world around him was already bleeding. By the time he could walk, soldiers patrolled his village. By the time he could speak, he had already learned the language of fear. The seeds of Boko Haram were already in the ground. It began in 2009 when a preacher named Mohammed Yusuf declared that Western education was evil, that democracy was a fraud, and that Sharia must rule by force. He was killed, but his ideas did not die. They were inherited by a man far more dangerous, Abu Bakr Shekau. Shekau turned ideology into terror. He burned schools. He bombed churches. He kidnapped children and turned them into soldiers, brides, and leverage. And within that machine of cruelty stood a young foot soldier named Bakoura, quiet, loyal, disciplined. Where others questioned, he obeyed. Where others hesitated, he killed. He was not charismatic. He was not loud, but he was precise, unflinching. And when Shekau died in 2021, consumed by his own madness, the movement could have collapsed. But it didn't, because Bakoura didn't want reform. He wanted revenge. While some factions of Boko Haram splintered or negotiated with governments, Bakoura doubled down. He became the torchbearer of pure terror, rejecting compromise, rejecting politics, rejecting anything but fear. He didn't speak in press releases. He spoke in fire. Perhaps his most haunting act came in March 2024 in the town of Kuriga. At 10 a.m., more than 300 schoolchildren were abducted in broad daylight. They were taken from their classrooms, laughing, learning, dreaming, ripped into trucks like cattle, their uniforms still fresh, their pencils still warm. The youngest was 6. Parents ran behind the vehicles, screaming. And Bakoura, he left no demands, no message, just silence, because the silence was the message. That moment broke something inside Nigeria. It wasn't just another tragedy. It was a mirror. A reminder that even after billions spent, after years of international training, the government still could not protect its children. Kuriga became a wound that never closed. And in that wound, Bakoura became more than a man. He became a myth, like Bin Laden in Tora Bora or Pablo Escobar in Medellin. His name was no longer just a name. It was a code for failure, for humiliation, for a state that could not keep its promises. Every time he resurfaced, another ambush, another abduction, he seemed more untouchable. And yet, for the people of Difa, Maiduguri, and Baga, life had to go on. Mothers still fetched water. Fathers still prayed at dawn. Children still tried to learn under trees with no walls, because even under terror, life refused to die. But Bakoura thrived on this cycle. Every time a village rebuilt, he burned it again. Every time peace was announced, he shattered it. Every time people believed in tomorrow, he made them fear today. And that, more than his bombs, more than his bullets, was his true weapon: hopelessness. He didn't just command fighters, he commanded doubt. Because if people believe that evil always returns, that no one will save them, then terror doesn't need to fight. It only needs to wait. And, for a long time, Bakoura waited. In the marshes, in the silence, in the fear between heartbeats. He became Africa's Osama, but without the headlines. For years, no photo, no location, no voice, just ashes in villages and shadows in classrooms. And the world? It moved on. Western media covered the Kuriga kidnapping for 2 days. Then came another headline, another war, another scandal. But in Africa, his shadow never left. And that is what made August 15th so powerful. Because on that morning, the silence ended. The man who built his empire on doubt was finally touched by certainty. 3 bombs, 1 desert, no more myth. The boy from northern Nigeria, who became a ghost in the reeds, was now just a body in the sand. And, for the first time in years, the villagers of Lake Chad asked, what does it feel like when fear dies first? Climates and reactions. It wasn't just a kill shot. It was a declaration, a roar. Niger, long dismissed as a fragile state, had done what regional coalitions, French air power, and UN missions could not. It ended a myth, and it did so alone. At dawn, on August 15th, 2025, 3 fighter jets rose into the sky above Difa. They weren't stealth bombers. They weren't 5th-generation aircraft. They were aging metal birds, piloted by men whose courage outweighed their tech. Their target? Chilawa, a sliver of marshland nestled between shadows and shame. Bakoura believed the area untouchable. He had mocked past drone flights. He had survived French-led raids, Nigerian offensives, even multinational task forces. But this time, the desert had eyes. Human intelligence had converged. Rumors became coordinates. Every whisper was double-checked. Every signal scrubbed. In a war room in Niamey, commanders stared at blinking screens like surgeons before an incision. The order was given. The first bomb dropped like thunder without rain. Villagers looked up, expecting a storm. The second, clean, silent. The third, final. When the smoke cleared, Bakoura was gone, not escaped, not relocated, gone. And suddenly, across Lake Chad, something shifted. Soldiers in battered outposts let out war cries. Mothers wept, not in grief, but in disbelief. Boys on the edge of manhood whispered, "We can win." The strike was surgical. No civilian casualties. No botched follow-ups. No long-winded speeches. Just precision. Just silence broken by fire. But with triumph came tension. Celebration hung heavy with suspicion. Because how many times before had headlines declared, "Terror leader killed"? How many times had a corpse been paraded, only for the man to reappear weeks later? This time, Niger insisted, was different. Bakoura's body was confirmed by DNA. High-ranking Boko Haram lieutenants were among the dead. Encrypted radios went dark. Still, fear lingered in the alleys of Difa, the markets of Maiduguri, the refugee camps of Maradi, because people had learned terror doesn't die quietly. Already, whispers spread. Would Boko Haram retaliate? Would ISWAP absorb the remnants? Was Bakoura now a martyr? In Washington, analysts debated. In Abuja, politicians claimed joint credit. In Paris, the silence was strategic. But for those on the ground, the only question that mattered was, what comes next? And here lies the heart of the moment. This was not just about Bakoura. This was about a state refusing to be humiliated again. For years, Niger had been seen as the sidekick in a Western-led war on terror. Its soldiers were trained, but rarely trusted. Its intelligence was shared, but never believed. Its people bled, while foreign troops held press conferences. But August 15th flipped the script. No more begging. No more waiting. No more being a pawn in someone else's game. Niger acted. Like Israel at Entebbe. Like America in Abbottabad. Niger bet everything on one shot, and it landed. And while the global community processed the implications, one fact was already clear across Africa. The wind had shifted. Youth in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey took to social media. If Niger can do this, what are we waiting for? No more French flags. No more foreign bases. Our enemies bleed too. Bakoura is dead. Sovereignty lives. The symbolism cut deep. This wasn't just military. It was emotional, psychological, generational. The Sahel, once known only for poverty and instability, had suddenly become a symbol of precision, courage, and awakening. But even as hope surged, so did the danger. Because wounded beasts strike hardest, and Boko Haram, fractured but not finished, still held territory, still had commanders, still fed on despair. And the West? Would they celebrate Niger's independence or fear it? Would they applaud this African triumph or quietly resent losing control? For now, the streets of Difa danced. Women ululated in the night. Men carried rifles with new pride. And children, finally, slept through the darkness without waking in screams. But the desert remembers, and the marshes never sleep. The real test would come not in the next strike, but in the next silence. Can sovereignty survive the echo? Civil, political consequences. Bakoura is dead, but the war is not. And now comes the harder part, the part without explosions, without thunderous headlines, the part where nations must build after they've bled. Across the Lake Chad Basin, from the dusty alleys of Difa to the refugee camps of Maiduguri, a cautious hope flickers. It's the kind of hope that whispers, not shouts, because the people of this land have danced with disappointment too many times. They know killing a man is easier than killing his legacy. The victory in Chilawa was a turning point, but only if Niger acts with discipline. The schools still stand half-collapsed. The roads remain mined. Thousands of families are still living in exile, too afraid to return home. And the danger is not just from the marshes, it's from the vacuum Bakoura leaves behind. Because when power dies, chaos comes to collect. Already, intelligence reports speak of new commanders emerging, younger, angrier, with less loyalty and more ambition. Some are defectors from Boko Haram, others are aligned with ISWAP, the Islamic State's West African branch, and some were trained by Bakoura himself. They're not just inheriting a cause, they're inheriting his legend, which is why, in the wake of this strike, the people do not just want more bombs, they want roads, schools, water, trust. They want to know that their government can protect them not just with jets, but with justice. And here, Niger faces a choice. Do they fall back into dependence on foreign troops, foreign aid, foreign praise? Or do they rise like Burkina Faso did? Because across the border, another name has been rising through the Sahel like a storm: Ibrahim Traoré. At just 35, Traoré has become a symbol of African self-determination, a soldier who dared to confront both terrorists and foreign puppeteers. In Burkina Faso, he didn't wait for international permission. He kicked out the French military, restructured the army, and doubled down on protecting civilians, not through speeches, but through steel and strategy. And in doing so, he inspired a generation. The youth of Mali, Niger, Guinea, and even Senegal began whispering, if Traoré can rise, why not us? Why should Paris or Washington dictate our war? Why should we wait for help that never comes? This is the real political earthquake now shaking the Sahel. Bakoura's death is not just the end of a warlord, it's the signal of a new African doctrine that security is not outsourced, that sovereignty is not requested, that dignity is defended, not granted. In the streets of Niamey, murals now appear, one of Bakoura's face crossed out, next to a painted fist, and beside it, another face, Traoré, smiling, in uniform, because in the minds of many young Africans, August 15th didn't just avenge Kuriga, it validated a movement. The AES alliance, formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, is no longer seen as just a military bloc. It's seen as the last stand of African pride, a rejection of neo-colonial entanglements, a rebirth of Pan-African confidence. But such momentum is fragile. It can burn bright or explode in all directions. Already, Western media frame Traoré as anti-democratic, a populist, dangerous. But to the villages forgotten by global policy, he is something else entirely, a leader who doesn't ask permission to protect his people. And Niger now stands at that same crossroads. Do they return to old habits, relying on French drones and UN blue helmets? Or do they seize this rare moment, this post-Bakoura void, to define a future on African terms? Because if they don't, someone else will. Boko Haram may be bruised, but not broken. ISWAP lurks in the shadows. Foreign interests are already lobbying in backrooms, offering stabilization packages that smell like dependency. This is the cost of victory. You must decide what to do with the silence that follows. Because if silence is not filled with purpose, it will be filled with new enemies. The people of Kuriga still live in tents. The children abducted. Some are back. Some are not. The trauma is real. The rebuilding must be relentless. And the only way Niger can honor the dead is by fighting for the living. Let Bakoura's final act be not a bombshell, but a blueprint for a region that refuses to bow, a region where Traoré's defiance meets Difa's resilience, where sovereignty is not a slogan, it's a system, a sacrifice, a shared mission, And in that mission, Africa may finally find peace. U.S. and world perspective. From the outside, it seemed like just another counterterrorism success. In Washington, analysts nodded at the intel. In Paris, foreign affairs briefings were quietly updated. And in UN chambers, the moment was marked briefly before moving on to the next crisis. But the truth, no one saw this coming. Not from Niger. For decades, Niger had been categorized, not respected. It was the place where Western troops deployed, not where they listened. A zone of interest, never a center of initiative. And suddenly, without drones from Nevada or soldiers from the Sahelian French bases, Niger had done what the coalition of powers had failed to do for years. It shattered a myth. The elimination of Bakoura didn't just unsettle terror networks. It embarrassed the global security establishment because it begged the question, if Niger could do this, what were the rest of us doing all this time? For many Americans, especially those who remember September 11th, this story has a familiar rhythm, a faceless enemy, years of failed hunts, one surgical strike that reclaims national dignity. But here's the twist. In the U.S., we had Navy SEALs, stealth helicopters, satellite precision. Niger had courage, intelligence networks, and aging jets. And yet, the outcome was the same. So the question becomes, what are we willing to learn from this? Because behind the scenes, a new reality is setting in. Africa is no longer just asking for help. It's making moves, taking shots, not waiting for permission. And for the West, this is unsettling because every move like this, every Traoré speech, every Niger airstrike challenges a century-old assumption that Africa can only react, never lead, that sovereignty is symbolic, not strategic, that resistance must be managed, not respected. But as Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali shift toward autonomy, the balance of soft power begins to tremble. And yes, there will be pushback, media framing, policy debates, economic pressure, because real sovereignty always threatens someone's interests. But if there's one lesson Americans know well, it's this. When a nation decides to stand on its own, not even fear can stop it. So now the world watches. Will Niger be punished for its independence? Will Traoré's rise be crushed before it spreads? Or will this be remembered as the moment Africa said, enough? The answers are not written yet, but the silence in Western capitals grows louder. And sometimes, silence is just fear, wearing a suit. Bakoura is dead, but the storm he fed still rolls over the Sahel. In the days after August 15th, celebration echoed through Difa, but even in joy, unease coiled like a serpent in the dust, because the region knows a painful truth. When you cut off one head of the Hydra, another grows. Already, whispers stir in the marshes. Commanders rally remnants. New names emerge, eager to wear the cloak Bakoura left behind. Boko Haram, fractured though it may be, is not dismantled. Its most radical branch still hides in the swamps of Borno. And ISWAP, the Islamic State's affiliate, waits like a vulture. To some analysts, Bakoura's death is a double-edged blade, a victory in tactics, but a spark for retaliation, because in this war, funerals become recruitment posters. Every fallen leader becomes a myth, and the myth becomes a magnet. But the deeper question isn't just military. It's economic, political, moral. Who has been feeding this fire all along? For years, reports have traced weapons and cash back to distant wars, black market routes, even foreign governments. Guns used in the Sahel bore serial numbers from Libya, Ukraine, and beyond. The money flowed through smuggling networks, Gold, cattle, oil, even people. And some of that money? It came from global actors, those who, publicly, fight terror, but privately profit from its persistence. This is the real battlefield, not the desert, not the jungle, but the shadows. The strike on Bakoura was visible, but the forces that kept him alive for years, they're hidden in boardrooms, embassies, and encrypted chats. And so, Niger now faces a final, brutal truth. Killing a ghost is not enough. You must burn the house it haunted. That house is built from lies, dependency, and fear. And now, it must fall. But it won't fall on its own. It will take leadership. It will take fire. And it will take voices that refuse to be silent. To those watching from abroad, especially Americans who know what it means to fight shadows, this is your echo. The Sahel is not just Africa's war. It is a chapter in the global struggle for dignity. So ask yourself, who benefits when Africa bleeds? Who fears a continent that stands? And what happens when the hunted start to hunt? Because Bakoura is gone, but the myth of invincibility is cracked. And from that crack, light pours in. If you believe no child should ever be stolen from a classroom, if you believe courage is louder than silence, if you believe Africa has the right to roar, then let your voice be heard. Like, comment, share. Not for algorithms, but for history. Because stories like this are not written by those who whisper, they are written by those who roar.